In this video, I'm gonna be teaching you how to get industry standard professional sounding drums using an objective approach. I'm calling this video 6 steps to an objectively professional drum mix. This works for any genre in any mix. First, checking phase and polarity. That's there. Regardless of our genre, we still need to check phase and polarity. Second one is gain staging drums. We definitely need to gain stage our drums to ensure that our plugins are operating at their optimal level, as well as we're not just overblowing our mix. We're gonna be using compression to control our drums dynamics and make them awesome and punchy and powerful and all those good traits. We're gonna be using EQ to clean up our drums and obviously make them punch and cut through the mix well. 5 is we're gonna be talking about drum bus processing, how to process your drum bus so that it always sounds pro. And then also number 6 is effects, how to use effects effectively in your drums to get the most out of them. Phase is essentially time-based, polarity is directional based. And I know that this is not the scientific definition of these terms, however, it is the functional definition that you can take and actually utilize in your mixes today. So let's talk about polarity first. In this example, we have a kick in and a kick out, and they are basically the same signal, right? They're miking the same instrument. We have the first one, the kick in, is going down on its very biggest peak. And on the bottom, it's going up on its very biggest peak. What this is going to do, if we overlap these, is they're going to cancel each other out because they're exact opposites. And ultimately, if we have an exact opposite sound wave that hits itself, we are then going to end up with nothing inside of mix. Phase now. So phase, as I mentioned earlier, is time-based. Basically, if we have a kick in, a kick out, and they're directionally correct this time, right? So the polarity is not the issue. However, as you can tell, there's still some cancellation going on here because at a different part of the sound, it is now going down, the other part is going up, and therefore we're still gonna end up with this cancellation result. And so this is ultimately what it looks like when you have a phase issue inside of your kick drum. Phase and polarity is first, so let's dive into that. In this case, there's really no big issues with the phase. Kind of an interesting mix going on in general with the drums because we have this kick, and then we also have an 808, which oftentimes you could replace just the 808 with the kick. So the only place that would potentially run into issues is over here. Biggerize those, zoom in, so we could see, right, these are relatively well aligned. There's no like major issues that I'm seeing. If anything, this could move back a little bit. Let's undo that. Actually, I do like that better. Go ahead and experiment, see if there's any issues, right, with your tracks. I think this actually benefits the track quite a bit. Even though these aren't playing together most of the time on those hits that they do both come in on the downbeat. It's a nice marriage of the phase. Okay, that's it for phase cancellation or polarity issues on this one. Now we're on to gain staging drums. The first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, what is gain staging to begin with? And in order to ask that question, we need to define what is gain. And so there's an issue because gain is often called volume and volume is often called gain. And these two ideas are fundamentally different. However, they are used to describe the same thing oftentimes because of where it sits in the signal chain. Let me break this down for you very simply. Gain is simply a signal going into a process, regardless of what that process is, whether it's EQ, compression, distortion, a signal chain, anything. Gain is the signal going in, volume is the signal coming out. So the goal of this process of gain staging overall, when we're talking about a signal chain, a plugin, a EQ, regardless of what it is, our goal is to have a certain level of gain going in and the same amount of volume going out. And that is measured in decibels. So if we have 10 decibels going in, we want 10 decibels coming out. So the natural question is, how do we measure this? Because there are two primary ways to measure volume or gain in a signal. It's either going to be average volume or peak volume. Only time I use peak volume is actually at the very beginning of the mix. I'm going to use peak volume to make sure that I have enough headroom in my tracks that any processing I do is not only going to be at the ideal volume for my plugins, but it's also going to leave me plenty of headroom for my mix bus and ultimately not be peaking right from the beginning and ultimately be fighting with my faders the entire mix. So I'm going to use peak volume first, but for all of processing, so EQ, compression, distortion, anything that I do on my tracks, I'm going to use average volume because average volume is what humans actually hear. We're able to better identify if our EQ, say, sounds good after the change. So if I make a change that adds volume, I want to gain stage that back down so it's still matching before and after using average volume. And because that's what I'm hearing, I'm able to then make a more objective decision whether that change was good or bad, because I'm not going to be inclined towards the decision that made the volume higher. The next stage is, where do you actually gain stage in your mix? And I kind of alluded to this. The first place is the raw tracks. Before we start mixing, we need to gain stage our raw tracks or our raw regions inside of our tracks. We want to gain stage EQ, compression, and any effects that we add to the drums as well. So let's dive into gain staging raw tracks. The first rule that you need to understand when gain staging raw tracks is that your peak volume, right? This is the only time we use peak volume in the mix. The peak volume should be between -10 decibels and -20 decibels. The reason why we do this is that plugins sound ideal when our tracks are within this range. Some hits are going to be quieter, some are going to be louder. However, within that general range, the plugins are going to operate at their optimal capacity because that is how manufacturers designed their plugins to work. Oftentimes I get mixes from students, and this is the first thing that often comes up, is that their tracks are peaking at -2 decibels, -1 decibel, and ultimately our plugins can't deal with that kind of gain going into it. It's just overwhelming it. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, literally. And your plugins are the ones trying to drink from it, and they just can't do it. They can't handle that much signal going in. So if we actually lower the signal going in and we use a normal garden hose, now they can actually drink it just fine and ultimately deal with our tracks at their optimal capacity, the best. So we're gonna use our little shortcut here, functions, to go to normalize region gain, set to 12 decibels in individual regions, apply, and then we should have a much more level drum mix here overall. So we may need to go back and actually re-volume balance because I've already done that, unfortunately, but let's go ahead and do that really quick. Okay, so now we're diving into drum compression. So the very first thing that we're gonna cover is shell dynamic goals, the shell being the kick, the snare, and the toms. The first one is just consistency. You need these to be ultra consistent in the mix, especially for a modern feel for a mix, because we want to be able to hear every single, shadow hit on the snare and every single kick that, even if they're, doing some little double pellet action, that their left leg is a little bit weaker than their right leg, we can still hear that occurring inside of the mix. So the first goal is always consistency. The second goal is going to be impact and energy, to make sure that we have this fullness sounding, but also that punch that comes from a well-mixed kick or snare or tom. So what are the common issues with shell dynamics? These are going to relate to the goals, generally speaking, because if their goals aren't met, they're an issue. So the first one is macro dynamic variation. You can tell the first hit is very weak, the second two are very strong. So ultimately we don't have very good macro dynamic variation. Macro dynamics being the overall note to note variation, and micro dynamics being the individual relationship between the tail and the transient of the note, which we're gonna dive into a little bit more here in a second. So the next issue that we have with shell dynamics is lack of beefiness or weight behind those, the kick or the snare or the toms. And then the last one is lack of impact and punch, to make sure that it's poking out, it's forward, and ultimately has that nice punch that we're looking for. Let's dive into the actual shell compression chain. I'm going to be talking about types of compression. If you don't know the types or styles of compression, make sure you're getting the compression style guide down below. There's a link in the description and also likely in a pinned comment that you can download this guide for free. So let's dive into the first stage of the compression, which is consistent type compression and also gain staging. We've already talked about gain staging, and so I'm not going to cover that. However, consistent type compression can definitely play a role in this particular mix, because we definitely have a lot of variation in our tracks variation in our kicks and the snares and toms that we likely want to control. Okay, so now we're diving into thickness type compression here. The goal of this type of compression is to decrease the transient and increase the tail, which is ironic because this is rather counterintuitive to what we actually want, generally speaking, with our drums. We want very strong transients and very weak tails because that's what's going to create that impact and punch. But thickness is a really great way to just make our drums beefier and fatter, and then we're going to deal with the impact and punch for the next style of compression. Okay, so the next type of compression that we're going to be adding to these drums is punchy type compression. So punchy type compression is increasing the transient and decreasing the tail of the notes. This is very intentional because I can just balance this perfectly with the thickness and the punchy type compression. If I want more thickness, I can just add more thickness type compression, or if I want the drums to be more punchy, I can just add more punchy type compression. So I can just balance these perfectly because we're decreasing the transient with the thickness and then increasing the transient with the punchy. I can just balance it exactly as I want to with my shell. If you're struggling to get that industry standard quality for your mixes, then go ahead and check out my book, The Objective Mix. It teaches you the objective standards of how to get an industry standard quality mix. There's a link in the description if you are interested in that. Let's get back to the video. Obviously, we're using samples. We don't need consistency type compression. That's just going to make it more compressed for no additional actual gain from that. So let's think about thickness quality and also the punchy quality. Do we need one more of one versus the other, or do we need them at all? Yeah, I don't know if we need thickness, but I'm gonna add it just in case and then kind of see what comes out the other end. And if we like that quality, then we'll go ahead and keep it. So fast attack, fast release, ratio of 3:1. Yeah, let's gain stage that. I think I do like it. I think it's a little bit more controlled sounding. Okay, minus 22.7. So that is 2.5. Okay, here's without. Here's with. Yeah, pretty subtle, but I think I do like that additional thickness. Very, very dry. There's nothing really to it. So I think that that's going to actually add a lot to this mix overall. So let's finish out this kick here. Overall. Ooh, yeah, especially in the mix, that's nice. I really do think that there's a lot more punchiness we can add to this though too. I'm gonna go ahead and still use this 1176. So let's use the longer attack. The beauty of digital instruments or digital gears, we can break them because normally 1176 you can't actually have a slow attack, it just doesn't work. But in the digital realm, I can do whatever I want. So here's without, so 22.6, so 24.7, so that is 2 decibels. Yeah, okay, so here's without. Ooh, yeah, no, that's way punchier in the context of the mix without compression. Yeah, just way more punchier, way cleaner, that. So let's dive into this 808. Yeah, so for this one, because it's kind of a bass as well as a kick, I'm gonna use a very similar process as the kick compression. So I'm gonna drag over this thickness type compression. I'm gonna use this in parallel though, instead of just using straight up thickness type compression. Because you can tell all of that just initial hit is, or that initial transient's just shaved completely off. And so it sounds a little kind of bad in solo here, but it's gonna sound really great in the context of the mix after I mix this back. And so the goal here is to not only shave off that transient, but make that tail ultra consistent. That's really the goal that I have with this, is just make that tail very consistent with itself. So I want the end of the tail to be relatively equal to the beginning of the tail and not to drop off so much, because it's taking that place of the bass of the song. And so I want it to be as consistent as possible throughout the entire note. Gain stage this really quick. So okay, so it looks like it's minus 23.7. So we need another 4 decibels. Yeah, there we go. That is sounding really great to me. So here's without. And then here's extreme compression. You can just tell how much more consistent that tail is. Again, obviously we're shaving off that transient, which is not a good thing. And so we're gonna back this off significantly. All right, and then we're gonna be adding that punchy style compression as well. Hype up those transients again. Make sure we're getting that rhythm that's it's providing to the song. So again, longer attack, longer release, and let's go for it. There we go. I'm liking it. Okay, so here's without. So minus 23.8. 25.7, so that is 2 decibels. So here's without any compression on that. Yeah, it's just more punchy and also more full, which is great. So that was exactly my goal with that 808, to just, as you can tell, we're also hearing a little bit of a click right there. So I might go ahead and just crossfade that really quick, or fade that out, just so we don't hear that click. If I had more time, I'm gonna go through the whole track, but okay, let's go to the snare. We're basically gonna copy this style of compression over. So here's the snare. So without 33.5. So 1 decibel. Yeah, just make those nice and fat. Punchy style compression. Let's give it a go. Uh, 34. 34. Yeah, it just brings it more, it brings it closer, brings it more intimate. So counter snare. Yeah, so that one's, again, almost the same exact tone and everything, so we don't have that much. That's sounding good. As we have these little filter sweeps, we are losing a little bit of gain on these. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw a compressor on here and do consistent style compression. I just want more consistency note to note in this take. So let's go ahead and do that, even with the filter sweep on there. Yeah, so it's just bringing up that a little bit. reverse cymbal doesn't need any compression. EQ for drums. So let's get started. The first one we're going to cover is kick. The first problem that we have with kick is a low rumble. So the low rumble is going to be in this region right here, but anything below 35 hertz, you really can't hear in a kick anyway. We just don't need this information in the kick. The next EQ move that we're going to want to pursue is the fundamental of the kick. So this is the core fundamental of the kick. Generically speaking, we want to emphasize this because this is where the core sound of that low end of the kick actually lives. Okay, so the next one that we're going to want to deal with is any masking that is occurring inside of the kick. In a bass, you'll have a fundamental of the bass somewhere in this low region, right? Fighting with the kick exactly. And so we want to deal with this masking going on because the kick right here, as you can see, is masking all of that area that is the fundamental of the bass, which the fundamental of the bass right in this case is 70 hertz. So we're not actually done with masking quite yet. The kick also lives in this upper region, right? So 125 to 500 hertz. And sometimes it's actually very, very present in this region that not only sounds generally kind of wooden sounding. When we're looking at this region though, we also want to look at the rest of the mix. So the guitar's living here, the vocals are living here, the bass is also living here. And so essentially we're just running into all these items that would better serve them rather than the kick. So we just want to move the kick out of the way of those elements in the mix. All right, so the next issue or next move that we're going to want to pursue with the kick is the definition of the kick. So the definition will live in this range somewhere with all kicks. Most of the time, I find people trying to boost in this 3K range a lot with kicks, even though the 3K range is kind of the magic frequency of bringing stuff forward, which again is the reason why everybody's boosting here, because it brings the kick forward in the mix and it makes them feel like the kick is right up front where it needs to be. However, it's also going to be introducing excess harshness in the mix, and also it prevents you from boosting other elements there, and then you're going to cause additional masking, such as the lead vocal will generally sound really good in that 3K range. However, kick, obviously, if we're boosting the kick in that range, end up fighting with all those other elements. Okay, so our next area for the EQing the snare is the meat of the snare. And so that's really going to be looking at this fundamental of the snare. So I will almost always boost right below the fundamental because I want even more of that just body, that like oomph of the snare. Okay, so the next one that we're going to be dealing with is harmonics. So in this case, we have a very distinct harmonics happening, and you can hear that ringing, and that's really these harmonics at work just ringing out. It's the tone of the snare. And in this case, a kind of a nice desirable quality, depending on what we're going for. If we're going for a very, kind of retro sounding snare, generally we're going to leave these harmonics in there. If you want a very dry, modern snare sound, then you're going to want to cut these out. All right, so the next one we're going to be running into is snap, crackle, and pop. So this is really where the just aggressive, that crack of the snare comes in, and I couldn't find another analogy for this characteristic of the snare other than breakfast cereal. So this is where the crack comes in. The last one is brightness and sizzle. So this is going to be the brightness of the snare, all of that top end information. Oftentimes you'll hear a lot of modern snares especially being boosted here heavily because it gets that nice crispy quality out of the snare. All right, so now on to EQ for the individual drum mix elements. So let's start with the kick again, low pass or high pass if we need it. So let's analyze our kick first, see if we even have any issues to begin with. It's actually pretty clean, so we've got a nice solid fundamental with nothing underneath of it, so I don't think we need to do any high passing. Let's focus on the fundamental now. Yeah, I think actually right below that fundamental is really nice. Okay, so this one is kind of interesting because we have two elements that are both living in this low end that are in the same exact place. So what we don't necessarily want to do is just double down in the same exact region. They're just going to mask each other and ultimately just lose impact for the mix overall. So what I'm going to do is I've boosted here at 59 hertz. So I'm going to go over to my Phoenix 808 and I'm going to cut right at that 59 hertz. And we're going to be pretty narrow with that cut. And I'm also going to go quite extreme because now I'm actually going to raise up every frequency around that area. So before, we essentially have these two competing elements, and now we've separated their fundamental frequencies to actually have some separation and clarity inside of the low end. So they actually have their own little spaces. None of them are really sacrificing anything though inside of this mix. So one other thing, just kind of woody area of the kick. Actually, I shouldn't even say woody because this is the woody. I'm just gonna cut a little bit over here because I want more room for this 808 to live. Because it's you know, has some cool little like licks in that area that I want to bring out. And so there are a lot of elements in this range, this mid-range. So that we've got violins, we've got guitars, we've got pianos. Everything is in that range. So we're definitely going to be cutting this area just a tad, right? Just make more room for those other elements without covering them up. I'm not gonna be too extreme though, because I kind of like that character in the kick. This to gain stage it. So here's without. Oh. Just the kick. So minus 22.7. So 1 decibel louder. Let's go. Okay, so now we're onto the Phoenix. So we've already done a little bit of EQ. So we brought out the fundamentals, right? We have some fundamentals that are going up here. So I'm also boosting in that region. In terms of how I'm gonna be EQing, this is a lot like a bass guitar. We're gonna have a lot of energy in this, also mid-range, low mid-range. I do like some of that character that's being brought out there, so we're going to be boosting there as well. And then just a little bit on the top end to get some of that definition of those hits out here. Yeah, it's not doing too much, it's doing enough. Okay, so minus 23.7. Okay, so we've gained a decibel or so. Okay, so here are those two in context. Let's just make sure we like those changes. Now let's move on to the snare. And again, the first thing we're gonna be checking for is some low rumble. And there's actually a little bit in there, so let's go ahead and cut that. And so we can tell the actual true fundamental is at that 250 hertz. And then that's a harmonic actually. So let's go ahead and bring out that actual real body or real meat. And I'm gonna bring down this harmonic a little bit. It's a little too much crack. And then it definitely needs some more top end sizzle. Okay, so here's without. Minus 34 with 34.7, so 7.7. Yeah. It's just cutting through that mix so much better with that, especially that little top end boost and also the boost on the fundamental, making it meatier, but also cutting through the mix. Take a look at this other counter snare. Yeah, that's really not necessary. So let's boost this fundamental right below it. Ooh, yeah, I like that. And then this kind of mid-range, I'm not a fan of. Yeah, there we go. It's kind of like that, I want to say hollow texture, but just this like, that region just could use is a little bit too strong. It doesn't sound bad by any means, but it's just too strong in this snare. All right, and then bring out just a little bit of brightness, air. And I think I'm adding quite a bit of gain, so let's see. Okay, so 37.1 with 36.8, so actually only about 0.5 decibels. Yeah. Honestly, I kind of like this counter snare as the main snare, but I didn't produce this, so I can't make that decision. All right, so here is the hi-hats. Yeah, so these ones, ironically, don't have any like ultra top ends, so that's really the only thing I like feel like they really need. The one thing that's bothering me is that the kick needs a little bit more top end to it to really cut through the mix. So I'm gonna be adding just a little bit of saturation. I'm gonna be using a preamp emulation here. There's definitely ways to do this with stock plugins as well, but this is just a little easier to do quickly. Actually, let's try this London. Let's make sure we're not adding too much gain. So here's without, so minus 21. Yeah, so we're adding quite a bit of gain here. So let's try again. There we go. Add a little bit back. There we go. And then I'm gonna actually move that EQ below that saturation. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so it's just adding a little bit more of that air. I'm actually just gonna add a little bit more top end. There we go. A little less mid-range still. Then you're probably already producing and mixing your own music. And if you're unable to get that professional sheen or quality or vibe for your songs, then I want to let you in on a little secret. Most mixers are trying to compensate their lack of professional mixes by getting more plugins, by using more advanced tips or tricks or techniques in their mixes, or relying on buying more professional gear in order to compensate for their lack of quality mixes. But in reality, most mixers' core problem is actually mixing subjectively, or approaching mixing from just a creative mindset entirely. Obviously, mixing is still a somewhat of a creative skill. It's actually far more objective than most people realize. Because if we think about it, everyone agrees on what a professional mix actually is. If that weren't the case, then it would be an entirely subjective field. But in reality, mixing is actually incredibly objective because everyone agrees on what a pro song sounds like. And so mixing objectively can actually help you avoid being your own worst enemy inside of your mixes, and ultimately allow you to just check all of the boxes that a professional mix should check, and then your mix will sound objectively professional. And so if you're mixing your own music and you're motivated to actually learn the objective skill of mixing, and if you want to ensure that your music sounds pro, then I would love to help you out by teaching you the 5 objective standards that everybody is judging your mix by, and how you can use objective mixing to solve those 5 problems inside of your mix, and then also how to do all of that in under 3 hours per song without pro gear, premium plugins, or utilizing templates or presets. So if this is something that piques your interest, then go to theobjectivemix.com to order my brand new book, The Objective Mix. This will teach you how to mix objectively professional mixes every single time you sit down to mix. This provides you with my entire mixing workflow, along with all of the breakthrough lessons that I've learned in the last 16 years of mixing music. So if that is interesting to you at all, then again, go to theobjectivemix.com or click the link right below this video. Can't wait to see you on the inside. With that, let's get back to the video. Okay, so now we're diving into the drum bus, and here's my go-to bus compression chain. Without any further ado, I'm going to be adding is a thickness type compression in parallel. So just a reminder, thickness type compression is decreasing the transient and increasing the tail. This is just to give the entire drum bus a little bit more meat, and then also have the entire drum bus just move in rhythm with one another. So the cymbals are being ducked a little bit by the snare and the kick, creating a lot of glue, but also some additional thickness in the drums entirely. Okay, so our next type of compression is punchy type compression. This should not be a surprise. This is just bringing up kicks and snares, just adding some more impact again overall to the kit. And this will actually add a little bit of pumping as well to the cymbals, which usually we're trying to avoid that sort of movement. However, in this case, it actually sounds really good if we hear this kind of pumping in the cymbals. It just adds more energy to the drums overall, and you'll hear it actually a lot in many drum mixes that you'll hear on the radio, especially for rock. So if you're listening to a rock mix on the radio or just on Spotify, wherever, pay attention to those drums. You're gonna hear a lot of those pumping in the cymbals. Okay, so now we're diving into drum bus EQ. So the first thing that we're going to be dealing with in the drum bus EQ is low rumble. Again, similar to the rest of the tracks, if there's anything that made it through or the compression brought out, we want to deal with that with EQ. So that's, again, going to be in this low area around here. All right, so now we're going to deal with the fundamentals. So oftentimes we'll be boosting on these fundamentals if we feel like they could be enhanced a little bit more with our drums. So the 2 fundamentals that are the most key is the kick and the snare. As you can see in this image, you have the kick right at that 60 right below 60 hertz, and then the snare right at that 200 hertz. So those are going to be the key points that we may consider boosting, or just boosting this whole area, because it's also going to be allowing us to boost some of the fundamentals of the toms as well. All right, so the next thing that we're going to be dealing with is masking. Again, this middle area is the most common area that we're going to have any masking going on. So we're going to want to be very cautious about boosting here especially, but oftentimes we can do with a nice little cut here to get this out of the way of the rest of the mix. All right, and then the last one is harshness. Aggressiveness is going to be in this kind of 2 to 3K range. Again, if we wanted to be more aggressive, we might end up boosting here, or if it's sounding a little bit harsh, we might be cutting here as well. All right, and then the last one is brightness, crispiness. Again, similar to everything else, the brightness and crispiness is always in this top range, 8K plus, for our thickness type compression on our drum bus. And I'm actually considering removing the 808 from this because it's actually a little bit too long. I'm gonna remove it from the drum bus entirely. All right, so let's go ahead and gain stage this. So minus 22.3. Yeah, there we go. All right, and then let's mix this back a little bit. Every time, sometimes you just don't think you need it, but then every time you do. All right, so I'm gonna use an actual bus compressor for this next one. So we're gonna use SSL. We're going to do a slow attack and a long release. Her knee is going to be relatively high on this guy, and then 3-to-1 ratio. All right, so here, let's gain stage this. So minus 22.7. So minus 21. Okay, so here's without any drum bus compression. Hitting harder in the mix. So here's in the context without. All right, and then the last step of the drum bus processing we want to do is add a little bit of EQ. Again, the process is going to be looking at fundamentals, any low-end rumble, which we didn't have any, so I wouldn't expect to have any additional or low-end issues, but we're going to be taking a look at the fundamentals and then also some air and then any mid-range masking that may be occurring. All right, adding a little bit of gain. There we go. All right, so now we are on to drum effects. The first drum effect that's going to almost automatically level up our drums is saturation and distortion. This is going to add additional thickness and also additional just sonic harmonic information that just sounds great with drums. I had a very, very difficult time mixing my drums until I started adding saturation and distortion to the drum bus, because that is just so characteristic of that drum sound that you're used to hearing on Spotify or wherever you listen to music. After saturation and distortion, we have reverb. And reverb is a very interesting topic when it comes to drums, because there's approved reverbs, which is plate reverb and chamber reverb. And the reason that these are the approved reverbs is that there are no early reflections when it comes to these types of reverbs. These are basically made up reverbs that don't really exist in real life, in terms of we don't hear this in everyday life. A plate reverb is literally a metal plate that we attach electrodes to produce sounds, which then creates this reverb effect. Chamber reverbs are where we're actually sending a signal from a recorded snare, say, and then we're sending it to a speaker that's in an attic, and then we have a mic on the other side of the attic that's then picking up that reverb. So there's essentially no early reflections because it's just one single chamber that's picking up all the sound all at the same time. Technically speaking, there are early reflections in chamber, but functionally speaking, there are no early reflections in either of these reverbs, and they're very safe to use with drums if we want to add some drum reverb, specifically with our snare. All right, so the next one that we're going to be diving into is the drum room effect. So in our drums that we don't have a room, which is a great way to just add more thickness, just kind of bring the whole drum kit to life. And so if we don't have those drum rooms, we can actually create a drum room for ourselves by using this effect. Talking about how to set up the drum room, this is our generic setup that we have. So all of our kick, snare, toms, overheads, all that stuff is going to the drum bus, which is then going to our mix bus. So we're going to add another bus here that's going to create this drum room effect. So this is now the drum room. So we send all of our individual items, including the overheads, to the drum room, which the drum room is then going to be processed and then sent back to the drum bus, essentially creating another track that doesn't actually exist in our mix, but it can exist because we're able to create it. And then inside of the drum room, we're going to have our drum tracks obviously going to this room, which is going to be a room reverb. So we want to intentionally use a specific room reverb because this is going to emulate a real space that we're used to hearing, like a studio, a live room, something similar to that. There are two types of reverbs that exist in the DAW and plugins. And these are algorithmic versus convolution reverbs. So algorithmic reverbs is essentially, as the name would imply, it's just an algorithm. It's taking in sound and then as an algorithm to then produce some sort of reverb on the back end that is meant to loosely relate to a real life space, versus convolution reverbs are actually where an acoustician actually goes to a room like a church or a hall or even a generic studio room, and they will measure different signals coming out of the speaker, and then they measure the signal in various areas of the room to essentially create a reverb using a real life space. So convolution reverbs are way more CPU intensive, so they're going to use more energy from your computer to actually run them, but they're also much more accurate when it comes to these types of reverbs. And in this case, we always want to use convolution reverbs if we have access to them. Logic even has some stock options, so if you're using Logic, you're in luck. We already have those inside of our stock suite of plugins. Reverbs that you do not want to use in this case are plate reverbs or chamber reverbs. Again, because these don't have early reflections, part of the whole point of adding this room reverb is to make it sound like it's in a real room, in a real space. And so these would actually not benefit us because they don't have those early reflections, and therefore they don't actually emulate a real space. Rooms to use is a room reverb or a hall reverb. I always lean towards room reverbs. They are the safest option by far. Halls tend to be a little bit too big and too boomy, so if you have a very empty mix, it can be a good option. But if you have a thick mix like the one that we have, we definitely want to be leaning into that room. And it's also what we're used to hearing, so it's going to sound the best with our drums. And then we're going to send that to a thickness type compression that's very, very aggressive. And so this is going to completely blow my 3 decibel rule out of the water in terms of we're only going to compress 3 decibels at a time. However, it's acceptable because the rest of the drums, the main drums, are not being compressed with this compressor. This is just an additional drum bus room, an additional room mic, essentially, that's going to just add additional thickness. So it's kind of like using this in parallel, although we have this obviously reverb in front of it to change the characteristic of it. And then after that, we're going to be sending that to the drum bus to be further processed by the drum bus to unify this room with the rest of the bus and ultimately create a really awesome sounding, lively drum mix. All right, so now we are on to drum effects. The first drum effect that's going to almost automatically level up our drums is saturation and distortion. This is going to add additional thickness and also additional just sonic harmonic information that just sounds great with drums. I had a very, very difficult time mixing my drums until I started adding saturation and distortion to the drum bus, because that is just so characteristic of that drum sound that you're used to hearing on Spotify or wherever you listen to music. And I'm going to be choosing to use a tape saturator because this is just very characteristic of drum buses that we're used to hearing, or drums that we're used to hearing. So here we go. Here's without. it's just that sound that we're so used to hearing, and all of a sudden now it's very much in that direction of a more professional drum mix. So one other option that we have, stock plugins such as just a normal distortion plugin is oftentimes a really great option as well. If you don't have tape saturator or anything, we can just use this. Oftentimes I'll be adding these to the individual tracks as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw this on our kick in, also our snares. Yeah, it's just fattening those guys up. And I really like that tape on that drum bus. It's sounding the last thing I'm going to do, let's just add that to the toms as well. I think it's going to sound really nice. Yeah, that sounds awesome. After saturation and distortion, we have reverb. And reverb is a very interesting topic when it comes to drums because there's approved reverbs, which is plate reverb and chamber reverb. And the reason that these are the approved reverbs is that there are no early reflections when it comes to these types of reverbs. These are basically made up reverbs that don't really exist in real life in terms of, we don't hear this in everyday life. A plate reverb is literally a metal plate that we attach electrodes to produce sounds, which then creates this reverb effect. Chamber reverbs are where we're actually sending a signal from a recorded snare, say, and then we're sending it to a speaker that's in an attic, and then we have a mic on the other side of the attic that's then picking up that reverb. So there's essentially no early reflections because it's just one single chamber that's picking up all the sound all at the same time. Technically speaking, there are early reflections in chamber, but functionally speaking, there are no early reflections in either of these reverbs, and they're very safe to use with drums if we want to add some drum reverb, specifically with our snare. So let's go in and add just a little bit of reverb to these snares because plate reverb, we're going to be using any plate reverb will do. You don't need to have premium plugins, but this is just an easy one to dial in. Let's use this gold plate. I think it's going to sound really nice. And then I'm going to EQ this a little bit because I don't want to add too much bottom end to this signal because it's just going to muddy up the mix. So I'm going to slowly shave off the top and bottom here just to move the reverb a little bit back from the snare itself. And then I'm going to back off a little bit more actually on this bottom end. I'm hearing too much of those harmonics poking through. I'm really liking this 2K range, so that's where I'm cutting here to avoid that. All right, and then obviously that's a little bit too much, so let's back off the time. And then also just the amount of signal going to that reverb. It just kind of lengthens that snare a little bit, just enough to bring more life into it, which I think sounds awesome. Another option, if you want to go for a more stylistic type of reverb, you could go for a reverb and a gate. So essentially, a gated reverb is going to then have a lot of reverb and then cut it off. So it's very characteristic of a lot of 80s songs. You'll hear this like, and then it'll just immediately cut off. That is a gated reverb. Basically, we're just adding a gate to the end of the reverb to cut off that tail. All right, so the next one that we're gonna be diving into is the drum room effect. So in our drums that we don't have a room, which is a great way to just add more thickness, just kind of bring the whole drum kit to life. And so if we don't have those drum rooms, we can actually create a drum room for ourselves by using this effect. Talking about how to set up the drum room, this is our generic setup that we have. So all of our kick, snare, toms, overheads, all that stuff is going to the drum bus, which is then going to our mix bus. So we're going to add another bus here that's going to create this drum room effect. So this is now the drum room. So we send all of our individual items, including the overheads, to the drum room, which the drum room is then going to be processed and then sent back to the drum bus, essentially creating another track that doesn't actually exist in our mix, but it can exist because we're able to create it. And then inside of the drum room, we're going to have our drum tracks obviously going to this room, which is going to be a room reverb. So we want to intentionally use a specific room reverb because this is going to emulate a real space that we're used to hearing, like a studio, a live room, something similar to that. There are two types of reverbs that exist in the DAW and plugins. And these are algorithmic versus convolution reverbs. So algorithmic reverbs is essentially, as the name would imply, it's just an algorithm. It's taking in sound and then as an algorithm to then produce some sort of reverb on the back end that is meant to loosely relate to a real life space, versus convolution reverbs are actually where an acoustician actually goes to a room like a church or a hall or even a generic studio room, and they will measure different signals coming out of the speaker, and then they measure the signal in various areas of the room to essentially create a reverb using a real life space. So convolution reverbs are way more CPU intensive, so they're going to use more energy from your computer to actually run them, but they're also much more accurate when it comes to these types of reverbs. And in this case, we always want to use convolution reverbs if we have access to them. Logic even has some stock options, so if you're using Logic, you're in luck. We already have those inside of our stock suite of plugins. Reverbs that you do not want to use in this case are plate reverbs or chamber reverbs. Again, because these don't have early reflections, part of the whole point of adding this room reverb is to make it sound like it's in a real room, in a real space. And so these would actually not benefit us because they don't have those early reflections, and therefore they don't actually emulate a real space. Rooms to use is a room reverb or a hall reverb. I always lean towards room reverbs. They are the safest option by far. Halls tend to be a little bit too big and too boomy, so if you have a very empty mix, it can be a good option. But if you have a thick mix like the one that we have, we definitely want to be leaning into that room. And it's also what we're used to hearing, so it's going to sound the best with our drums. And then we're going to send that to a thickness type compression that's very, very aggressive. And so this is going to completely blow my 3 decibel rule out of the water in terms of we're only going to compress 3 decibels at a time. However, it's acceptable because the rest of the drums, the main drums, are not being compressed with this compressor. This is just an additional drum bus room, an additional room mic, essentially, that's going to just add additional thickness. So it's kind of like using this in parallel, although we have this obviously reverb in front of it to change the characteristic of it. And then after that, we're going to be sending that to the drum bus to be further processed by the drum bus to unify this room with the rest of the bus and ultimately create a really awesome sounding, lively drum mix. First thing that I want to do with this one, similar to the last couple, is add some saturation. So again, I'm going to be reaching for this tape saturation. And so, yeah, that's just sounding really, really nice on that drum bus. I don't have anything else that that I feel that needs more compression or more saturation. The snare's already cutting through. It sounds full. The kick already has some saturation on it. And so beyond that, I think that our next phase of drum bus processing is going to be adding our drum room. So again, just because these are synth drums or sampled drums does not mean you don't want to use a drum room. Let's add our drum room over here. Drum room reverbs. Again, we're using our convolution reverb, not our algorithmic reverb. Let's go to small spaces again. Rooms. Let's try a live stage. Why not? It's too bright. Ooh, that's nice. I like it. It's a recording room. I think the drum booth is still the best. I'm gonna do some gentle high and low pass just to remove any unwanted mud. Now we're gonna get super fun and a compression. And then I'm gonna add just a little bit more grit to this. I just think it's a little bit too clean. All right, so here's the context of the drums. Oh, in the context of the mix. So I think you can really hear it in the click of the kick. That's the place that I'm really hearing it the most. So I'm gonna play it one more time for you. Pay attention to the click of the kick.